Hi, I'm Matthew.
Cheerio, I'm Aaron. And today we're going to be talking about the English Pale Ale. That was my best impression of it, in a best English accent. I apologize, it was
Did
horrible.
a good job.
Anyway, today we're going to be talking about English Pale Ales. Now, the Pale Ale style is a pretty broad, actually it's a very, very broad term. There's a bunch of different styles of Pale Ale. There's an American style Pale Ale, there's an English style Pale Ale, and within those styles, there's a broad interpretation of what a Pale Ale could be. But most English Pale Ales, definitely older than their American counterparts, are more they're more malt forward, whereas the American versions are a little bit more, or sometimes a lot more, hop forward. So with these malt forward beers, these English Pale Ales, also sometimes called bitters, but don't be thrown off. They're not bitter tasting. We have maybe what is the quintessential English Pale Ale, and that's Bass Pale Ale. Right, Matthew?
That's right. It was first brewed in 1777, so it's very, very old. And in fact, you may recognize the red triangle logo. That red triangle was actually the very first registered trademark in all of England. Bass sent out a brewery representative to camp out overnight, hearkening to some of our...
like the iPhone.
Exactly, like the iPhone,
Just
except
like the iPhone.
with trademarks. So it actually camped out overnight to become the very first person in line at the new trademark registration office in England to become the very first registered trademark. And that was all the way back in 1876. Now, the Bass Pale Ale comes in at 5% alcohol, which is actually very, very common for this style of beer. 5% all the way down to about 4.3%. Now, Bass Pale Ale has a rich and storied history. It's been featured in many different movies and many different works of art. One notable inclusion in that is the Impressionist painter Edouard Manet, his depiction of a bar at the Folies Bergère features this beer as well. Now, why don't we go ahead and taste this beer and we can talk a little bit more about the actual characteristics of the English style Pale Ale.
Okay. Now this, I believe, is from a town in England called Burton-on-Trent, right?
That's right, and Burton-on-Trent is very, very famous for their water source, which is the river. The water from the river is very, very high in calcium and magnesium and very low in sodium and sulfites, which gives a nice chemical and minerality composition to the water, which some brewers will say is the most perfect composition to brew beer with in the entire world.
Yeah, I feel like water is very often overlooked when it comes to brewing beer. I mean, it's such an important ingredient. It makes up north of 90% of beer, right? It does water, so I feel like it's overlooked a whole lot. Water is very important.
I tend to agree. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. Oh, that's a beautiful color.
It's a nice golden, burnt amber sunset. I'm getting a little verklempt here looking at it. It's just beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Very nice and clearly polished. High levels of filtration in this beer. Really, really just a pretty beer to look at.
Mm-hmm.
You can also see in the head we have a slight ivory, maybe a little bit of an eggshell off-white color with a nice kind of creamy, frothy composition.
Yeah, it's not totally white. It does take on a little bit of that brownish tint from the body of the beer, it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Very nice.
Wow.
Really nice, slightly toasted caramel malt.
Some spices. It's been a while since I've had this beer, but I'm picking up more spices than I remember.
It's like a little bit of an allspice, maybe. Toasted toffee.
And the head retention is pretty good. Sometimes with these English style pale ales, their head retention, the head quite isn't as full because some of them are a little bit lower in carbonation. So if you have a beer that's a little bit lower in carbonation, it's perfectly okay if that head doesn't form as well as you'd expect. But this one's holding together pretty well.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of depth in that aroma, isn't there?
Yeah, it surprises me actually. All right, dive in.
Cheers.
Cheers. I definitely am getting that sweetness. A lot of really nice, deep sweetness from the malt. I'm assuming that's from the malt.
Yes, yeah. Your malt is your sugar source. So most of the inherently and natural sweet flavors that you'll come through in a beer will come from your malt. This has got that very nice kind of a slightly sweet caramel, a little bit of toffee, maybe a little bit of like a burnt brown sugar flavor as well. That all comes up really right on the very front of the palate.
It's got a little bit, thinking about that water source, that minerality you were talking about earlier, I think I'm picking up a little bit of the minerality on the hang of the beer, on the finish of the beer.
A little bit. Yeah, it's got almost a little bit of like an earthiness to it.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is also due to the style of hops that they use, which is an English style hop. And that differs very much from American style pale
That's
ales.
right, I almost forgot about that.
Yeah, American style pale ales will typically feature much more citrus and much more pine, whereas your English varieties of hops will tend to be a little bit more earthy, floral, almost kind of like a potpourri type of a flavor and aroma to them, which I think really kind of helps to balance out a little bit of the sweetness, although I would still consider this pretty malt forward.
Oh, definitely, especially comparing it to the American IPA versions, like something like a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which is kind of the gold standard when it comes to American IPA or American Pale Ale APA versions. But this is a very nice beer. I feel like this is a pretty sessionable beer as well.
It's light medium on the palate. Very clean, easy finish. It's got a lot of character to it. But it's certainly not overwhelming, and there's nothing offensive about it. I can't imagine this beer really turning anybody off.
Yeah, that's very, very true. I think it's a really, really good suggestion for a guest who wants to dip their toe into craft beer, but is a little bit shy of hops, which is very, very understandable.
Sure, and another thing that makes this beer great to recommend to your guests is that it does come with such a good tradition in brewing. There's a lot of history behind it. There's also a great deal of name recognition. Bass Ale is traditionally 1/2 of the black and tan drink.
That's right.
Mixed with Guinness. So people already kind of recognize it, but it's not something that you see every day. So if somebody may be intimidated by some of our more extreme styles of beer from the majority of our American brewers, perhaps you could recommend a Bass Pale Ale. Give them something that's a little bit different than maybe their regular macro offerings, but nothing that's too offensive, and it's certainly not going to turn them off to craft beer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And when you're pouring black and tan, if you're using Guinness and Bass, make sure you put the Bass in first. Seen that happen a lot. Guinness always goes on top. Looks like it's a heavier beer, but it's not.
That's right. All right, another success.
Cheers.
Cheers.